Women regularly say to me, "You're funny, I like you, let's go for a drink together." Unfortunately, I wake up not long after that, but no, that's irrelevant. You can forget that. I don't know why I told you that. But because that's not the focus of today's video. The focus of today's video is aircraft as a war-winning weapon, and answering the question: when did ships go from being the war-winning weapon of choice, and when did aircraft take over? As a side note, obviously I'm not saying that you can win a war just with aircraft. I can't personally think of any examples when that's happened. If you can, let me know. And obviously if you want to occupy territory, you need boots on the ground. And obviously aeroplanes don't wear boots typically. And if you want to fight a war overseas, then you might want to transport your aircraft using an aircraft carrier, which is of course a ship. And supplies often come in ships, although of course you've got transport aircraft. My main point is that aircraft aren't the only weapon you need, but if you want to win a war, you need air superiority, or if you can get it, air supremacy. That's just sort of essential nowadays. But it wasn't always that way. In 1903, for example, before then, there were no aeroplanes, so obviously there weren't the war winners. It was ships, battleships, armoured cruisers, protected cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats. Those were the ships, those were the weapons even, that were going to decide if you were winning a war. Incidentally, in the late Victorian, early Edwardian era, there were some thinkers, there were some heads in the British Admiralty who thought that they should get rid of battleships entirely because torpedo boats were so good, and they didn't think that the slow, lumbering, inaccurate guns of the pre-dreadnoughts would be able to hit torpedo boats, so torpedo boats would just come along, torpedo the battleship sinks, there's nothing you can do, so they wanted to replace them with cruisers with a larger number of small caliber guns. It never happened, but it's just interesting. It's not relevant to today's video though. Anyway, 1903, the Wright brothers take off. 1906, Dreadnought was commissioned. And do you want to know how much the British naval architects at the time cared about aeroplanes? It wasn't even a little bit, because I think if you want to test how much of a threat aeroplanes were at any time period, you look at the anti-aircraft arsenal of ships of that era. For instance, Dreadnought had 10 12-inch guns, and then she had some 3-pounders to defend against torpedo boats, and that was it. I think she may have had some smaller calibers, but I don't think so. Anyway, those were the two biggest calibers: the 12 inches and the 3-pounders. Not a single anti-aircraft gun, because they weren't afraid of aircraft in 1906, and frankly, unless you're a man alone in the field and one crashes into you, it's not going to be a threat. The biggest threat aircraft, the people who were in most danger from aircraft in 1906 were the pilots. So they didn't bother putting any anti-aircraft artillery on ships. In fact, the first time a British battleship was designed with anti-aircraft guns was the Iron Duke class, which were built / commissioned. Actually, 1912 was when the Iron Duke class came out, and they had the first anti-aircraft guns on, and there were 2 of them, 2 3-inch guns. And that was it. That's all they thought they needed to have in order to defend a massive dreadnought. Just 2 15-inch guns. 15? 3. The Iron Duke class had 10 13.5-inch guns. I don't know why they chose 13.5. Why don't you ask them? And so you can see that by now aircraft are getting a little better. For instance, the Royal Flying Corps was also founded in 1912, and the Royal Naval Air Service, which was the Navy version of the Royal Flying Corps, was formed in 1914. So around that time, military aircraft are starting to exist, although you'd still be incredibly lucky to find one that was capable of 100 miles an hour. So still, if you want to get somewhere fast, the railways were faster than aeroplanes. of course, aeroplanes could go in a straight line. But what I'm saying is steam locomotives were faster than aeroplanes. So first British battleships that had anti-aircraft guns when they were designed. I say that because older ships were modified to have anti-aircraft guns on them. But the first ones that were designed with them, Iron Duke class, 1912. By the mid to late 40s, with HMS Vanguard, the last British battleship, she had 73 40mm anti-aircraft guns. And I'm not a mathematician, but I do know that 73 is bigger than 2. I can operate at that level. So obviously, all of a sudden, over just a space of 35 years, aeroplanes have become a much bigger threat. In fact, the highest ranking Allied officer to die in combat in the Second World War, Admiral Tom Phillips, but we'll get back to how he died later, that is relevant to the video, said in the 1930s that aeroplanes will never pose a threat to capital ships. We'll also get back to why that's ironic, given the circumstances. So I think we should maybe look at some specific events in history to try and decide when aircraft were really coming into their own. And I think the first one should be 1916, the Battle of Jutland, where one aeroplane was used. It was from the Royal Naval Air Service, and it flew a reconnaissance mission that lasted only 30 minutes because it broke down and had to land. It had engine trouble. And that was it. Biggest naval battle of the First World War, one aeroplane used. Obviously, they were used a lot more over the Western Front, but if we're comparing ships and aeroplanes, then one aeroplane used in 1916 in the Battle of Jutland. So obviously they weren't that important. They were still sending out battle cruisers and destroyers to scout, so instead of aircraft. So we can agree, throughout basically the entire First World War, aeroplanes did have a part to play, but it wasn't really on the combat side. It was more on the reconnaissance side of things. But that changed though the interwar period. There was only one. And in the Spanish Civil War, just before the start of the Second World War, the Germans bombed a lot in that, and it turns out that was quite effective. All of a sudden, you weren't any longer dropping bricks out the side of your cockpit. You were actually bombing with sophisticated bombers. On a side note, when people hear the word Stuka, they think of the Ju-87, and that is generally the colloquial name for the Ju-87. But actually, technically, all German bombers in the Second World War, at least in the early Second World War, were technically Stukas, because Stuka just means dive bomber in German, and every German bomber had to be capable of dive bombing, even the HE-111. So technically, every German bomber was a Stuka, but that's not relevant, that's just interesting. To be fair, none of this is relevant, it's just interesting. You don't have to watch this video. So, and then if we fast forward to the Battle of Britain, that is a battle that was purely fought in the air. So finally you can say, yes, aircraft are coming into their own. They are a vital war-winning machine now, because the Germans knew that if they were going to launch an invasion, they needed to destroy the RAF. They didn't destroy the RAF for the fun of it, tried to destroy the RAF for the fun of it. They did it, they tried to do it because they had to do it, because they knew that aeroplanes at this point were so sophisticated that you cannot launch an invasion force if you don't have air superiority. So obviously that's evidence that aircraft were getting better and more advanced. On a side note, before the Second World War, some military tacticians believed that aeroplanes had got so fast. I mean, they were going 300 miles an hour, can you imagine that? They were going so fast that dogfights would not be able to happen anymore, and that the way fighters would shoot down bombers is the bomber would just keep going straight, and it would let all the fighters queue up. All the fighters would queue up neatly, have a go at the bomber, peel off, let the next guy have a go, and in return the bomber's defensive gunners would just be going away as well. It was a bit crackers, but they didn't know. Actually, some people did at the time. Douglas Bader, for example, thought that was crackers, and it was. Anyway, the Battle of Britain. But I wouldn't call that the turning point because, as I say, it was fought purely in the air, and so compared to ships, not too much. There aren't many conclusions you can draw from this. However, with Pearl Harbor, that's a completely different story. That's big capital ships being bombed and destroyed by aircraft. They were taken by surprise, and they were stationary for the most part, but that's still big capital ships being destroyed by aircraft. And another example of that was Force Z, which was sunk on the... I'm just looking at my bits of paper. 10th of December 1941. And Force Z was the code name for the Royal Navy force in Southeast Asia. It was comprised of HMS Prince of Wales, which had only been commissioned earlier that year and had survived the Battle of Denmark Strait, where HMS Hood was sunk, and HMS Repulse, which was an older battle cruiser which had an armament of 6 15-inch guns. I've mentioned Repulse and Renown in a previous video because some people thought that having a massive ship only for the purpose of transporting 6 guns was a bit of a waste. Anyway, they were sent off with an escort of destroyers to Southeast Asia to bolster the Allied forces against the Japanese because things weren't going brilliantly at the time in Southeast Asia for the British Army. So Churchill said, right, we'll take these big, powerful capital ships and a destroyer escort, send them down, and they'll sort everything out. That didn't quite happen. He didn't send any air support. Now, it's not worth mentioning there were Spitfires and everything in the United Kingdom, but outside the UK, the RAF in the Middle East and Africa, and not so much in Africa actually, they did get Spitfires and Hurricanes in Africa. I'm not sure if they had them at this time though. Basically, when you got out into the Empire, the aircraft were significantly less sophisticated. For instance, you had Vickers Wesleys in the Middle East, and if you've ever seen a picture of a Vickers Wesley, you know that they don't look like they're quite up to the scratch of a Lancaster bomber, for instance, which had entered service with the RAF at this point. Anyway, so sends Repulse and Prince of Wales off into Southeast Asia, and they were attacked by the Japanese Air Force from the air. And within that day, both had been sunk, and that was the end of Force Z. And pretty soon after, Singapore fell, and the Allies were removed from that part of Southeast Asia for the foreseeable future. And remember Admiral Tom Phillips, he was the admiral in charge of Force Z, which was destroyed by Japanese aircraft. So he was wrong. You can't blame him really. In the 1930s, he probably was right. Anyway, so Force Z, I think, is a massive turning point, as I've said, because it's aircraft. It's aircraft versus capital ships, and capital ships did not win. And let's be honest, it's only been getting worse for capital ships after that. Yamato, the biggest, heaviest ship ever. Not ship ever. Come on, Douglas. The biggest, heaviest battleship ever was sunk by aircraft. It's a trend. For instance, in the Falklands War in 1982, all British ships that were sunk or lost were lost or sunk or destroyed by aircraft. Although you could say that that was because the Argentinian Navy never really took part in the war after the Belgrano was sunk, and you could attribute that to HMS, to nuclear submarines in the South Atlantic. But then you could also say that one reason why the Argentinian Navy never got really involved is also because of the Sea Harriers. So it's not clear cut, but the basic fact of the matter is that all British shipping was lost to aircraft. All British shipping that was lost, that is, we didn't lose all our ships. That would have been irregular. And just for that time, even, the Type 42s, which were the first air defence destroyers with the Royal Navy, they were called air defence destroyers, and they had one Sea Dart launcher which could launch 2 missiles before it reloaded, and that was all the missiles that the air defence destroyer had. It's worth mentioning actually HMS Bristol, the only Type 82 destroyer, did come before the Type 42s, but that class was cancelled after the construction of Bristol. So when I say they were the first air defence destroyers, they were the first largely built air defence destroyers, although Bristol did take part in the Falklands. And since the Falklands, the Type 23 frigates, I think, were designed basically on the back of the Falklands War. And the one overwhelming thing that they realised from that was we need more surface-to-air missiles on our frigates and our destroyers. So they went from Type 21 and Type 22 frigates, since the Type 22 had 12 Seawolf cells into sextuple launchers and goalkeeper and guns and Oerlikon cannons and that sort of thing, to the Type 23, which has a 32 cell Seawolf / Sea Scepter launcher, and the Type 45, which is the replacement for the Type 42. I don't know how they number them. I don't know why they do that. Has a 48 cell Seawolf / Scepter, 48 cell surface-to-air missile launcher, and the Type 26 that's being designed has a 48 cell as well. Not being designed, being built. They're building them now, which is again an upgrade from the Type 23. So basically, the overwhelming point is that ships are vulnerable. Surface vessels are vulnerable to air attack, and that I would say the turning point when ships were overtaken as main war-winning weapons would be the 10th of December 1941.